She believed her age meant love was gone, until a lonely rancher proved her wrong. The dust of Harper's Crossing settled like forgotten dreams on everything it touched. Main Street stretched barely a quarter mile, flanked by weathered storefronts that had seen better decades. The morning sun cast long shadows from the church steeple, while the saloon's batwing doors creaked in the desert breeze. Lillian Oakley walked the street as she had for 37 years, her wicker basket pressed against her hip, her steps measured and purposeful. Time had carved lines around her green eyes, not harsh, but deep enough to tell stories of disappointment. Her auburn hair, now streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in a practical bun beneath her worn bonnet. Men tipped their hats politely as she passed, their gazes sliding away like water off stone. Their eyes lingered instead on Sarah Beth Miller, barely 20, whose yellow dress swayed like sunflowers in the breeze. Lillian had worn yellow once. Now she wore the practical brown of a woman who had learned not to hope for attention. The mercantile's bell chimed as she entered. Inside, coffee beans and tobacco mingled with the scent of old wood and new leather. Marcus Abernathy looked up from his ledger, his spectacles perched on his nose. "Morning, Miss Oakley." "The usual. Coffee, flour, and lamp oil," she replied, her voice steady as a prayer said too many times. Behind her, laughter bubbled like a spring creek. James Hollister's voice rose above his young wife's giggles, confident and warm. Lillian's shoulders tense involuntarily. 3 years since their engagement ended. Yet the sound of his happiness still cut through her composure like a blade through silk. "And then the mare threw me right into the creek," James was saying, his arm around Sally's trim waist. Soaked to the bone, dignity drowned. Sally's laughter was music, untainted by rejection, unweighted by years. Lillian paid for her goods without turning around, gathered her basket, and walked past them as if they were strangers. Outside, the wind caught her shawl. She pulled it tighter and headed toward the edge of town, where her father's homestead waited like a faithful dog. The cabin stood solid against the prairie sky, its log walls weathered gray, the barn leaning slightly with age. 5 acres of hard-won land that demanded everything and gave back just enough. Inside the cabin, silence pressed against her ears. She lit the stove, put coffee on to boil, and sat at the scarred wooden table where her father had told stories of her mother, the woman who died bringing Lillian into the world. "You've got her gentle heart, Lily," he used to say. "Don't let this world harden it." Lillian touched her chest, wondering if he would recognize what lived there now. Sunday's service brought the familiar comfort of ritual. Reverend McGrath's voice rose and fell like wind through wheat, speaking of seasons and renewal, of God's timing versus man's impatience. Lillian sat in her usual pew, third from the back, and let the words wash over her worn spirit. After the service, as townspeople gathered in small clusters, she noticed him, a figure standing apart near the cemetery fence. Jedediah Kane, the man of Whispering Creek Ranch. Even at a distance, his presence commanded attention. Tall and broad-shouldered, he stood motionless as carved stone, his hat brimmed low, his coat dark against the autumn sky. She followed his gaze to a simple wooden cross among the graves. Mary Kane, beloved wife, taken by fever 4 years past. Dried wildflowers lay at its base, place of the widower's careful devotion. "Tragic thing," whispered Mrs. Henderson behind her. "A man that young, living alone with nothing but cattle and memories." "Cold as winter, that one," added Mrs. Garrett. "Never speaks to anyone in town. Some say he's forgotten how." Lillian watched him a moment longer. In his stillness, she recognized something familiar, the careful posture of someone carrying invisible weight. When he turned to leave, mounting his horse with fluid grace, their eyes met across the churchyard. The contact lasted barely a heartbeat, but something passed between them, an acknowledgment of shared solitude. That evening, as storm clouds gathered over the western hills, Lillian stood at her kitchen window, watching darkness approach. Lightning flickered in the distance like a broken lantern, and wind began to test the strength of fence posts and barn doors. She was securing the chicken coop when she felt it, the peculiar awareness of being watched. Turning, she gasped. A figure stood at the edge of her property, motionless as a sentinel against the storm's gray backdrop. Jedediah Kane. Thunder rolled across the prairie, and in the lightning's brief illumination, she saw his face clearly, weathered, stern, marked by a scar along his left jaw. He didn't move, didn't speak. Simply stood watching as if the storm had conjured him from her loneliness itself. Then the rain began in earnest, and when she blinked against the downpour, he was gone. 2 days later, Lillian discovered her south fence collapsed, rails scattered like broken promises across the muddy ground. She stood surveying the damage, calculating the cost of lumber against her meager savings, when hoofbeats approached. Jedediah Kane dismounted with easy grace, his coat dripping from a morning's drizzle. Without invitation or explanation, he began gathering the scattered rails, testing each for soundness. "I can manage this myself," Lillian said, pride stiffening her voice. He paused, fixing her with eyes the color of winter storms. "Didn't say you couldn't." His voice was rough as creek gravel, worn by disuse. "Just saying you don't have to." For an hour they worked in silence, him setting posts while she held him steady. His movements were efficient, practiced, the economical gestures of a man accustomed to solitary labor. When their hands brushed passing tools, she felt calluses earned by decades of honest work. "This'll hold through winter," he said finally, testing the last rail. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate. "Aye." But he was already mounting his horse, touching his hat brim in farewell. "Storm's coming tonight. Check your roof." He rode west toward his ranch, leaving Lillian with questions she couldn't voice and a fence that stood stronger than before. True to his warning, another storm struck that evening. Rain drummed against the cabin roof, and wind howled through the eaves like banshees. Lillian huddled by her fire, grateful for his advice as she heard shingles rattling overhead. Morning brought clear skies and discovery. Fresh wood stacked neatly by her door, enough to repair any storm damage. No note, no signature. Just a quiet gift of a man who understood what it meant to face hardship alone. Jedediah's visits became a rhythm as natural as seasons turning. Never announced, never intrusive, but regular as sunrise. He appeared when fences needed mending, when cattle strayed too close to her garden, when winter's first bite made simple chores treacherous. They rarely spoke beyond necessity, but their silences grew comfortable. She learned to read his moods instead of his shoulders, the tilt of his hat. He began to notice things, how she favored her left hand after carrying heavy buckets, how she hummed softly while working, how her smile transformed her entire face when coaxed into bloom. One December morning, after helping her split wood, he lingered by her kitchen door. Snow fell in lazy spirals, muffling the world in white silence. "Coffee's hot," she offered tentatively. He hesitated, as if warmth might be dangerous. Then, obliged. Inside, her cabin felt smaller with his presence. He sat carefully at her table, hat in his lap, while she poured coffee into mismatched cups. The silence stretched, but it didn't break. "You tend this place well," he said finally. "It's all I have." The admission slipped out unbidden. His eyes found hers. "Sometimes all we have is enough." Something in his voice made her heart skip. This was the longest conversation they'd shared, and it felt like crossing a bridge she'd never known existed. "Your wife," she said carefully. She was lucky to have someone who remembers her so faithfully. His jaw tightened. Mary deserved better than dying young. He stared into his cup. "Deserved the life I promised her." "We don't choose what we deserve," Lillian said softly. "Only what we do with what we're given." He looked up sharply, as if seeing her for the first time. The moment stretched between them, fragile as spider silk, until he rose abruptly. "Thank you for the coffee." After he left, Lillian sat alone with 2 cups on her table, wondering what she'd awakened in both of them. Spring's arrival brought both hope and trial. The creek ran high with snowmelt, cattle grew restless, and gossip sprouted like weeds after rain. Harper's Crossing had noticed the quiet partnership between Lillian Oakley and Jedediah Kane. "Peculiar match," observed Mrs. Henderson at the mercantile. "Her past her prime, him wed to a ghost." "Some folks are meant for loneliness," added Marcus Abernathy, not unkindly. But it was James Hollister who voiced the cruelest judgment, standing outside the saloon with his drinking companions. His voice carried clearly to where Lillian loaded supplies into her wagon. Cain must be desperate. James laughed. Taking up with a woman already put out to pasture, though I suppose beggars can't be choosers. His friends chuckled, but their laughter died as a shadow fell across the group. Jedediah Cain stood behind them, his presence sudden as judgment itself. A man shows his measure, Jedediah said quietly, by how he speaks of those who can't defend themselves. His voice carried no anger, only the finality of winter frost. You've shown yours. James's face flushed crimson, but he found no words. The silence stretched until he turned away, his companions following like embarrassed schoolboys. Jedediah approached Lillian's wagon, where she sat frozen with humiliation. Without a word, he swung into a saddle and rode beside her out of town, a silent guardian against the whispers that followed. That night, Lillian sat by her fire fighting tears she'd held back for years. When knocking came at her door, she almost didn't answer. Jedediah stood on her threshold, hat in his hands, his face grave. What Hollister said was true enough, she interrupted bitterly. I'm not young, not pretty, not... Stop. The command in his voice made her meet his eyes. You're the strongest woman I know, the kindest, he struggled with words, the most beautiful. Her breath caught. Jedediah, I'm tired of talking to ghosts, Lillian, tired of living half a life. He stepped closer, his eyes intense. I come here because when I'm with you, I remember what it means to be alive. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Years of loneliness, of believing herself unwanted, crumbled beneath the sincerity in his voice. I'm afraid, she whispered. So am I. His hand found hers, rough and warm and real. But I'm more afraid of letting you slip away. The spring storm arrived without warning, a wall of black clouds that turned afternoon into premature night. Lightning split the sky as rain lashed the earth, and Whispering Creek began its dangerous rise. Lillian was battling to secure her chicken coop when she heard it, the panicked lowing of cattle in distress. Through the storm's fury, she saw Jedediah's herd trapped in a low pasture as floodwaters surged toward them. Without hesitation, she ran into the tempest. Rain blinded her. Wind threatened to knock her down, but she pressed forward until she reached Jedediah's side. Get back, he shouted over the thunder. Too dangerous. Not without you, she shouted back. Together they fought to drive the panicked cattle toward higher ground. Lightning turned the world white-hot. Thunder shook the earth, and still they pressed on. Lillian's dress was soaked, her hair whipping free, but she held her ground beside him. A massive bolt struck nearby, spoken the herd into a stampede. Lillian found herself directly in their path, frozen by terror and exhaustion. Strong arms swept her aside as Jedediah pulled her against a fence, his body shielding hers as the cattle thundered past. They stood pressed together, hearts pounding, breath coming in ragged gasps. The storm raged around them, but in that moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. Lillian, he said, his voice rough with more than exertion. She looked up into his face, seeing not the control rancher, but a man stripped bare by near loss. Rain streamed down their faces as he cupped her cheek with a trembling hand. I can't lose you, he whispered. Not when I've just found you. She rose on her toes, and their lips met in a kiss that tasted of rain and redemption, of second chances and the courage to claim them. When the storm passed, it left behind a world washed clean. The creek returned to its banks. The cattle grazed peacefully on higher ground, and Harper's Crossing buzzed with talk of the night Lillian Oakley and Jedediah Cain had fought nature itself side by side. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday bright with promise, they stood together before Reverend McGrath. Lillian wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her mature figure, while Jedediah stood tall in his best suit, the scar on his jaw barely visible in the church's golden light. Do you, Jedediah, take Lillian to be your wife, in season storm, in plenty and want, for all your days? I do, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. And do you, Lillian, take Jedediah to be your husband, to stand beside him in joy and sorrow, in youth and age, for all your days? She looked into his eyes, seeing her future written there in certainty and hope, I do. When they kissed, sealing their vows, the congregation erupted in applause. Even James Hollister clapped, his young wife dabbing happy tears from her eyes. Outside the church, as rice showered down like blessings, Jedediah lifted Lillian onto his horse and swung up behind her. They rode toward Whispering Creek Ranch as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. "No regrets?" he asked softly in her ear. She leaned back against his chest, feeling his arms encircle her, strong and sure. Only that we waited so long to find each other. The prairie stretched before them, vast and full of possibility. Behind them, the bells of Harper's Crossing rang out their joy, and ahead lay a future neither had dared to dream. Love, they had learned, was not only for the young or the beautiful or the lucky. Sometimes it came to those who had waited, who had endured, who had learned that the heart seasons follow their own calendar. And sometimes, if you were very patient and very brave, winter's end brought the sweetest spring of all.